Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Sound Politics. This is a very special episode because today I will be interviewing Stanford professor Kharis Templeman. Professor Templeman is a research fellow at the Hoover Institution and program manager of the Project on Taiwan in the Indo-Pacific, as well as a lecturer in the Center for East Asian Studies at Stanford University. Outside of Stanford, Professor Templeman is a member of the US-Taiwan Next Generation Working Group and a country coordinator for the Varieties of Democracy project. So you're part of the Hoover Institution that visited President Lai last month, right?
That's correct. Yeah.
So what did you guys do? And like, what's it like to be part of the delegation and to meet the president?
All right. Well, so we did meet the president. We also met the vice president, the national security advisor, the former president, the minister of foreign affairs, and so on and so forth. And that's fun and interesting, and we learn a lot from that. But there was a lot more to the trip than just that. Actually, we typically when we do these kinds of visits, it's roughly a week in country, and the goal is to learn about kind of the state of domestic politics. What are the policy challenges that the leadership is concerned about? What are the concerns or challenges in the bilateral relationship with the United States and in cross-strait relations? And then we'll talk a little bit to a broader group of people about trends in civil society, youth politics, education, the economy, that sort of thing. And so this trip was like that. We talked to people in government, outside of government, young, old. We got a pretty good perspective, a pretty good set of perspectives on what's happening in Taiwan these days.
So did you talk to both like different political parties as well? And then
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. So we always try to do that, and Taiwan, I will give a lot of credit to the Taiwan government and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. They don't try to keep us from seeing the opposition party. There's a strong norm that if you are a foreign delegation visiting Taiwan, of course you're going to visit the KMT as well as the DPP, right? That's just expected, and there's no kind of attempt to hide them from us. Um, this most recent trip, we couldn't really get a meeting with the TPP, and that was not because anybody was interfering. It's just the TPP is in a bit of a crisis right now, and we also had a fairly short period of time in Taiwan, so they were pretty preoccupied when we got there.
nice. So when you talk about talking about like discussing uh, the relationships between Taiwan and the US and like how that will develop over time. And you also mentioned education. What does that entail specifically?
Well, so when we talk about US-Taiwan relations, one of the big questions is how is the Lai administration responding to PRC pressure on Taiwan, and how is that different from, say, Tsai Ing-wen's approach to cross-strait relations? And then what are their expectations from the US side, and what is the US expectation about Lai's cross-strait policy? And so there's you know, these conversations happen all the time in Taiwan with their US counterparts at AIT, but it's sometimes helpful to have a non-governmental group come in and ask different sorts of questions, and uh, to a different group of people, even in the Taiwan government. So defense, just in terms of the issues, defense and security issues are always close to the top of the agenda. Uh, Energy security actually is an issue that's come up more and more frequently. It was a topic of conversation in almost every meeting that we had in Taiwan. It's a lot of concern that Taiwan is overly reliant on imported fossil fuels, and that those supplies could be disrupted in the event of a blockade or a quarantine, or even just some kind of natural disaster, a typhoon that destroys a port or something. And so there's, I think, much more attention being paid these days in the United States to that challenge to Taiwan. And then the third issue that comes up a lot is the semiconductor industry and more generally high tech in Taiwan and the links to the United States. And there's a lot of interest in deepening cooperation and problem solving between the US and Taiwan in this industry.
Wow, that's really cool. And okay, so yeah, I wanted to also ask you, like how you got into this field of getting into getting into like getting so passionate about, Taiwan, China, and like Indo-Pacific region politics in general. So how did you get into the field? How did you start? And then yeah.
Right. So the initial spark for me was when I was an undergraduate in college, and I took a course on Chinese politics, and I just loved the course. The professor was a great teacher, and I decided that I wanted to go to China. I wanted to study abroad there. And so if you're going to go to China, it's helpful to speak some Chinese, and I didn't speak any. So I registered for a Chinese language course and took 1 year of Intro to Chinese, the very intensive version that met 5 days a week. And I then got a scholarship to do a study abroad in Beijing and then in Taipei. And that scholarship also allowed me to do a summer immersion school at Middlebury College in Vermont, which has uh, probably a dozen language schools now, and their summer language immersion programs are infamous, in fact, for the kind of rigor and the intensity of the training. So they're notorious for their language pledge. So you go in on your first day at school, you literally walk into a room together. You all sign a piece of paper saying you won't speak English the time you're there.
Wow.
And as soon as you finish signing, you have to start trying to speak in the language that you're in school for. And so for me, that was Chinese. I could barely string a sentence together, and but I was trying to survive in the language then for 9 weeks, and that experience helped build the foundation then for the well, help me develop a foundation in the Chinese language. And then when I went from there to Beijing, I could at least, my Chinese still wasn't that good, but I could at least survive in the language. And I was kind of thinking in the language for the first time. And so I did, I had that year of intensive language, and then I had a year studying abroad in Beijing and then Taipei. And the reason I got really interested in Taiwan was actually that I just by chance decided to go to Beijing first and then Taipei. And I went to Beijing and I really didn't like it. It was in the early 2000s. It was a huge, crowded, smoggy, traffic clogged city. It wasn't as developed as it is today. There were just a lot of things about it that were kind of hard to deal with. And then the second term, I came to Taipei, and Taipei, everything that I hated about Beijing was much better in Taiwan, including the political atmosphere. So people were really willing to talk politics in Taiwan. In fact, they loved talking about politics. I had 3 Taiwanese roommates. I was in the regular student dormitory, unlike at Beijing Daxue, and they were very interested in talking to me about Taiwanese politics. In fact, Taiwan had just had their first peaceful transfer of power. Chen Shui-bian had just won the presidency a year before. And so there was just this excitement in the air about Taiwan's transition to democracy and what was possible going forward. And so very quickly, I already knew I wanted to study political science, and in Taiwan, it was like everybody wanted to talk to me about that. My subject matter was everywhere, and so it was pretty easy for me to fall in love with it.
Wow, that sounds so exciting.
Yeah, I mean it's one of the great things about studying abroad too. It exposes you to a very different kind of environment and culture and people, and for a lot of us who study abroad, that it kind of it's life altering. For me, it certainly was. It changed my whole career trajectory.
Um, so what? do you have any advice for people who are interested in like studying political science or interested in studying abroad and then like are still deciding what what exactly they want to do and how they want to get into it?
Yeah, I mean, I think study abroad, no matter where you go, is a good thing to do when you're in college. It's you really have to grow as a person when you're in a foreign country, trying to speak a foreign language, dealing with unfamiliar customs and food and daily routines, and that builds resilience. You in order to survive in a place like that, you really have to grow. So that's one thing. If you want to get into political science specifically, um, I mean, the typical route is to major in political science in college, and maybe do an internship. Um, there are lots of internships in Washington, D.C., related to policy or politics work. If you have some study abroad experience, then you might consider doing an internship abroad as well. We at Stanford support a lot of overseas internships during the summer for our students, and so I'm part of the selection committee for students doing internships in Taiwan, and we send 4, 5, 6, something like that every summer to Taiwan. That's a good experience too, because most of those are their work internships. You might be doing some language study on the side, but you have to actually like function in a Taiwanese think tank or company or government agency, and so that's an unusual skill as well if you can pull that off. I'd recommend considering that too.
Wow. And speaking of Stanford, when you're not actively traveling to Taiwan, what do you do as part of the Hoover Institution on a day-to-day basis when you're not traveling or teaching? What do you do?
Yeah. So the program that I manage has a speaker series. So I organize that speaker series. We do an annual conference or symposium. I'm in charge of arranging that. Um, we host a fair number of visitors, both from Washington, D.C. and from Taiwan or elsewhere in Asia. So part of my responsibility is to either arrange those visits or to add people to the conversation to make it as representative or as useful as it can be for our visitors. It's a fair amount of just kind of serving as a network for people. So um, there's a large Taiwanese American community in the Bay Area who's interested in promoting Taiwan to Americans or learning more about what's happening in Taiwan. And so I do a fair number of talks, both public and private, related to Taiwan politics these days. And then I do try to keep an active research career going as well. So some of my work involves reading, writing, speaking about um, all the issues related to U.S.-Taiwan, U.S.-China relations, and Taiwan's own domestic politics.
Wow, great. And one last thing is uh, I want to just briefly touch on current events right now. Um,
Mhm.
for example, like Japan has just had a change of government.
Yeah,
What do you think that? How do you think that will affect Taiwan?
it's not clear yet, but it's increased the uncertainty about Japan's approach to Taiwan issues. The previous LDP government was quite pro-Taiwan, and was willing to do and say things publicly that Japanese leaders 10 years ago shied away from. So, for instance, they have actually issued joint statements with the United States expressing concern about the cross-strait environment and cross-strait stability. And privately, they've actually engaged with the Taiwanese in the security space a lot as well. So um, the current prime minister of Japan, who called this snap election and then lost his majority, uh, is one of the most pro-Taiwan LDP politicians. And as of now, it's not clear whether he will stay on as prime minister after this election or whether he will have to resign and there will be another leadership contest. If he stays on, I think that is probably better for Taiwan. If there's a new leadership competition and he has to leave, it's not necessarily the case that the person who replaces him will be as interested in robust public support for Taiwan. And so I think this is the right question to ask actually right now is what is Japan's role going to be in supporting Taiwan's own security going forward?
Great. I'd also like to. Have you met with the AIT in Taiwan during your last trip? The new acting AIT director and.
Yeah. So we did visit AIT. We didn't actually get to meet with the director, but typically almost every delegation that goes through Taiwan will pay a visit to AIT. The AIT, for those who don't know, is the American Institute in Taiwan. It's the de facto U.S. representative office there, and they're actually a quite large office now. The number of people there is almost as many as the embassy in Tokyo.
Wow.
And they have a quite new, large representative office building that looks just like an embassy. And they are very, very well informed about what's happening in Taiwan. So it's always a very useful visit to AIT. And I have a tremendous respect for the Foreign Service officers who work there. We always learn a lot when we go and talk to them.
Cool. And yeah, I think I think that's most of it. And the U.S. elections is coming up in like around a week, less than a week. Very, very close. How do you think the U.S.-Taiwan relations will change depending on the next government?
Excellent question. And I can't say for sure. I think there's a lot of uncertainty, both about how this election will turn out and in a potential Harris administration or a potential second Trump administration, who would be managing policy towards China and Taiwan, and what are their priorities? There's actually some uncertainty about whether Vice President Harris would, if she were elected, would she continue the Biden administration's approach, or would she kind of seek to steer China policy in a different direction? I think the most likely outcome is that we see a continuation of the Biden administration's policies, but that's not a guarantee. And then on the Republican side, if there is a second Trump administration, the first Trump administration was actually had at different times had very different approaches to both Taiwan and China, and where they ended up was providing pretty robust support for Taiwan, being willing to stand up to the PRC in a lot of areas where previous administrations had kind of avoided confrontation or tried to do stuff, if they did stuff at all, with Taiwan in a very low-key way. But Trump himself has expressed what I think are some worrying kind of views about Taiwan, that in his words, Taiwan stole the US's semiconductor industry, that Taiwan basically the US is an insurance company and Taiwan needs to pay up. Privately, he said that he doesn't think Taiwan can be defended or that it's not worth defending. And so there are many people in the Republican Party who don't share those views and actually are quite quite firmly committed to the idea that the US should defend Taiwan. But it's not clear who might serve in a second Trump administration and what views they would hold on that. So I think regardless of how this election turns out, we're going to move into a period of greater uncertainty in the US PRC Taiwan relationship.
Cool. Yeah, that's kind of worrying for me personally.
Yeah.
Can't
Yeah.
vote yet, unfortunately, but I will be
Yeah.
able to in 2 weeks.
I should say that sounded kind of scary. I should say there is there's a stabilizing factor in the relationship, and that's Congress. So Congress has a pretty important role to play in the US-Taiwan relationship, and there is really broad bipartisan support in Congress for Taiwan. And so even if you have a, say, Trump administration that is more transactional or more conditional in its support for Taiwan, I think there will be a lot of pressure on that administration from Congress to demonstrate support for Taiwan. And at least among the members of Congress, Taiwan does not divide the parties in the way that other foreign policy issues do. So in that sense, I'm fairly confident we'll have robust support from Congress for Taiwan.
Um, Recently there's been a lot of talk about continuing arms sales to countries like Ukraine and Israel. Some
Mhm.
people support that, some people support a more isolationist view.
Mhm.
Um, what do you think the weapons policy is going to be like in the future for US and Taiwan?
Yeah, well, so far I haven't seen a whole lot of concern from either the Biden administration or members of Congress about not providing or assertions that the U.S. should not provide more to Taiwan. The pendulum here has really swung towards more weapons, more sophisticated weapons, a larger kind of suite of capabilities to be provided to Taiwan. And that has broad bipartisan support as well. The bigger debate, I think, is over Taiwan's own priorities, what it requests to purchase versus what the United States side thinks is most appropriate and the best use of Taiwan's resources to purchase. And I think that tension will continue to be there, where the Taiwanese side is interested in purchasing, in some cases, large kind of offensive weapons platforms, F-16s or M1 Abrams tanks or Kid class destroyers, and um, the uh, the analysts in the Department of Defense have taken to maybe not openly discouraging that, but also suggesting that if you're going to purchase those things, you need to also consider a wider suite of stuff that gives you asymmetric capabilities, and that the current military imbalance across the strait is so large that you can't contemplate a kind of plane for plane, ship for ship attritional conflict, and you need to consider how you might get the same sort of deterrent effect or meet the same kind of mission with a much cheaper, more mobile, more easily disguised weapon system. And that Taiwan really needs to move much more dramatically and quickly in a direction of asymmetric, an asymmetric posture towards the PRC.
Mm. And what about like Americans' view of Taiwan and relations with the U.S. and Taiwan? And like, do you think it's an important enough issue in American voters' minds? And yeah.
I think it would be good if more Americans paid attention to Taiwan. For one, it's still the one issue in the U.S.-China relationship that I think could plausibly lead to an actual war between the United States and China. And So Americans should be aware of how that might occur and why Taiwan then matters to the PRC and to the United States. Um, it's the US's eighth or ninth largest trading partner, depending on when you're counting. So it's a very important economic partner of the United States. A lot of Americans now are aware that Taiwan produces more than 90% of the world's cutting edge semiconductor chips. They may not be aware, though, that Taiwan is a critical manufacturer of a much broader set of technologies that go into lots of consumer goods in the United States. And if the United States were to lose access to those, that would have a major impact on our own economy. We saw kind of a trial run of that during COVID when supply chains were actually disrupted because of COVID pandemic era restrictions on flights and trade. And we actually saw a significant economic impact of that in, say, the automotive industry in the United States, where chips that they needed to finish off vehicles weren't available because they'd been delayed because of pandemic era restrictions. And so that is, I think, an actual conflict over Taiwan would have an impact that's orders of magnitude higher than that. And that already got a lot of attention back in 2020, 2021 there. So, and then Taiwan is also a democracy, and it's also, it's a quite liberal, successful democracy as well. And I think we're in an era where democracy is kind of on the defensive around the world. A lot of democracies are struggling, and Taiwan's actually stacks up quite well compared to some of the newer democracies in Eastern Europe or in Latin America, or certainly in South Asia or Africa. And Taiwan got to be a democracy when it was, a firm partner and ally of the United States from the 50s through the 1980s. And so Taiwan is, in a sense, a nice kind of ideal case of what it means to be a U.S. ally and partner in the world, and the U.S.'s kind of influence in the world for good. And so I see Taiwan as Americans should be proud of what we were able to do to support Taiwan's economic development and its political development from a poor, insecure autocracy to one of the world's most liberal democracies today.
Great. So yeah, I think we're out of time, but it was so nice talking with you. Hope to see you again soon.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Do you think China will attack Taiwan?
When?
Like
uh,
like
I do not
2027?
think I do not think it will happen very soon, if it ever happens. I don't think the PRC is ready for a full conflict. I think, yeah, so no.
And do you think China will kind of sort of take over through the democratic process, or sort of kind of like fifth column kind of thing?
I mean, that's definitely a threat, and it's something that people in the US are aware of as a threat and concerned about. I think Taiwan's democracy is its best defense against that. And as long as democracy in Taiwan continues to perform well, as it did during COVID, as it's done during several closely contested elections over the last few years, and as it's done with just kind of nurturing and regulating the semiconductor industry in Taiwan, I think it's got pretty robust democratic defenses against that kind of action. And so, for the moment at least, I'm less concerned about that kind of threat. What I think more concerned about is that the U.S. loses interest in supporting Taiwan, and I think that's where the PRC's activities and energy is directed these days. It's at trying to convince the United States that we should move away from Taiwan. We should back away and leave it to its fate, and that it's not in our interest uh, to get into a confrontation or a conflict with China over Taiwan.
Oh,
The most plausible way that Taiwan gets swallowed up by the PRC is that the US decides it's just not worth it to defend Taiwan and we abandon it. And it's my firm belief that that should not happen, and we should work to ensure that the American people understand that and agree that that should not happen.
great. Thank you so much.
Yeah.